Sometimes the ones meant to love us most are the ones who break us into pieces. Sarah May learned this the night her family chose their own survival over her future, when the echo of her father's hand and the cold silence of her mother's tears pushed her out the door and into the jaws of a Montana night. Alone, torn, and barefoot, she staggered through the wild with only the distant howling of wolves for company, and a pain deeper than any winter chill clawing at her heart. What would you do when those who were supposed to protect you become the very reason you run for your life? And if a stranger opened their door, would you dare trust them knowing that every other bond in your life had been betrayed? Tonight Sarah May faces the darkness of the wilderness, and the darkness within, searching for hope where the world has only shown violence, greed, and loss. No one, not even she, knows whether her next step will bring salvation or a new kind of danger. With every agonizing step across sharp stones and frozen mud, Sarah's mind reels, her father's voice cold, as iron still rings in her ears. You are nothing but a pawn for this family's debts. Her mother, trembling but silent, had offered no protest, as their daughter was sent into exile for refusing to marry a man known for cruelty and buried wives. Each memory cuts deeper than the icy wind, slashing at Sarah's tattered dress. The world outside is vast, indifferent, waiting to swallow her whole. In the distance, a single light twinkles through the trees, a hope so fragile, it hurts to look upon it. Dare she knock, or will this be just another door in her life that slams shut tonight? In the heart of the wild, Sarah May's story will collide with that of a haunted stranger, and both will be forced to choose trust in a world that has only shown them betrayal, or surrender to fear and become lost forever. If you've ever wondered how far someone can be pushed, or what it truly means to fight for your own freedom, leave a comment below. Do you believe love and hope can survive such bitter betrayal? At what point does survival become defiance? Stay tuned, because this night everything changes. The world Sarah May Thornton once knew collapsed in one bitter instant. A home that should have been safe instead became a vault of cold calculation and betrayal. She stood in the center of her family's kitchen, the memory of her father's harsh words lashing her like the Montana wind outside. You are nothing but a pawn for this family's debts, he spat, not bothering to look her in the eyes as he counted the gold coins Marcus Thornfield had laid on their scarred table. Her mother, the figure who once tucked her in with whispered prayers, simply watched from the doorway. Tears cut clean tracks down her cheeks, but not a word was spoken in Sarah's defense. The silence stung most of all. Sarah's fingers trembled as she pleaded first for understanding, then for mercy, and finally for love. A love that should have been unconditional. But debt, shame, and fear weighed heavier than a daughter's worth. Her protests were met with threats, then the hard slap of her father's palm, coppery blood blooming against her tongue. Her final defiance was met with swift exile. Forced out still in her torn birthday dress, Sarah staggered to the yard, clutching only a locket, a faded link to childhood warmth, now forever out of reach. Outside, the night stole her breath, biting at her bare, bloodied feet as she stumbled toward the endless forest. The door shut behind her with a finality that rang louder than any gunshot. Overhead, a bruised sky pressed down. In the distance, wolves howled, voicing her fear and newfound solitude. Each step away from the house was a denial of the future her family intended, but also a step into uncertainty far more terrifying than any wild animal lurking in the dark. Too many stories circled in her mind, tales of girls alone on the frontier, swallowed by the cold, or worse, by men prowling for opportunity. Every icy gust seemed to whisper her name, promising she would not survive the night. But inside her, something stubborn flickered, a stubborn rising heat that refused heed to despair. She pressed on legs, shaking, thinking of her little sister Emma, terrified that she too would be flung to predators when the time came. Each low branch that tore at her dress, every rock that gouged her feet, drove the betrayal deeper. Sarah was not just escaping a marriage. She was fleeing the realization that to those she loved most, her fate was worth no more than the bottom line scribbled in her father's ledger. Pain, exhaustion, hunger. These were the teachers of the dark journey. Fear gnawed, yet mingled with defiance. Sarah's resolve sharpened with each labored breath. There could be no turning back, only forward. Even with no certain destination, only the slimmest thread of hope. That hope glimmered faintly visible at last, as a yellow window light through the trees, the promise of any shelter, any voice of mercy in the wilderness. Within Sarah, pain and sorrow warred with an emerging strength. For the first time, she understood abandoned innocence could become the root of her courage. As Sarah reached the edge of an unknown clearing, legs buckling, she caught her own reflection in the glass of a stranger's window. A girl unrecognizable, wild-eyed, and desperate, yet no longer a pawn. She raised her battered hand and knocked. Behind that door waited the next test, another soul marked by wilderness and wounds of his own. A haunted man, neither she nor fate could have predicted. But this night, born of heartbreak, would mark the rebirth of her will. And so Sarah, shaking, bloodied but unbroken, waited for the first answer in a world stripped bare of comfort and certainty. If you have ever stood alone on the thinnest edge between despair and defiance, would you have risked trusting a stranger's light in the woods? What would you have left behind to claim your own freedom as you ponder the story prepares to shift from exile to the chance collision of two ruined hearts at the world's end? Stay with us because Sarah's fight is only just beginning. Jacob Hartwell was a man accustomed to the solitude that crept through every crack in his sturdy Montana cabin, a solitude earned after too many years of watching good men die and justice twisted by those with more gold than conscience. He hadn't expected anyone, and certainly not a wild, desperate girl, blue dress torn to tatters, eyes hollowed by betrayal, shivering on his porch in the dead of night. For a moment, standing behind the rough-hewn door, Jacob wrestled with old instincts. 12 years as a Union captain and 5 as sheriff had taught him the costs of opening one's heart or letting down one's guard. Yet as the faint sound of Sarah May's ragged breathing seeped through the wood, something ancient stirred. It was not pity, but recognition, as if the pain radiating from the stranger outside matched all the hidden bruises in his own chest. When he lifted the bar, every muscle taut, in case of danger, what greeted him was not a threat, but a challenge to his humanity. Sarah May stood before him, barefoot, bloodied, one hand clutching a locket, the other balled into a fist, more out of fear than anger. She met his skeptical gaze with an echo of hope too stubborn to die. "Please, they cast me out. Can I just rest here just one night?" Her voice broke her dignity, a ragged thing clinging to threads. Jacob's first impulse was to protect his hard-won peace, to close the door and let the world's cruelty pass by. But her wounds were real, her desperation raw. He ushered her in wordlessly, and the warmth from the fire seemed suddenly too precious not to share. Inside, the divide between two broken lives became tangible: Jacob's order and solitude confronted by the chaos and need embodied by Sarah. As she collapsed into the battered chair, fighting tears with fists clenched in her lap, Jacob worked in silence, washing dried blood from her feet, pausing only to offer a gruff "I've seen worse." Her trust was slow in coming, but necessity outweighed propriety. She watched him warily, one eyebrow arched in challenge, the other in gratitude. Sarah's mind churned with shame and exhaustion. The man's scarred face, the haunted eyes that never rested. She wondered what sins had driven him to this wilderness, and whether they rivaled the sins that had exiled her from home. There was a protective edge in his careful distance, a loneliness that echoed her own. As the flames licked higher, Jacob ladled stew into bowls, the gesture as close to kindness as he dared. In the flickering light, confessions unfurled between them, in hesitant, halting bursts. Sarah's family had traded her life for solvency. Jacob's past as a lawman had cost him both faith and family. Each revelation exposed nerves already raw. Each silence between them said even more. Yet it was not suffering but gradual, fragile trust that began to grow. Over days, Sarah insisted on helping Jacob around the cabin, sweeping floors, feeding chickens, mending torn shirts by necessity. Yes, but also for the dignity work restored. Jacob was surprised by how quickly he grew used to her soft humming as she worked, the cautious smiles that brightened rooms where sunlight feared to linger. At night, as they sat near the warmth, stories slipped out unbidden. Jacob told her of his first love, Mary lost to the violence he could not stamp out. The admission trembled with old regret, yet Sarah listened without judgment, her own grief singing quietly in answer. Sometimes surviving is the only victory, he admitted, and she reached out, not for comfort, but for honesty, their hands meeting in a truce against loneliness. The maturing of their bond was never sudden. It was tentative mornings spent brewing coffee together, cautious humor shared over meager meals, the shy pride in Sarah's smile as Jacob taught her to shoot a colt, her palms trembling with both fear and exhilaration. Trust like hope grew with practice. Still shadows lingered. Sarah wrestled nightly with the fear that her presence would doom her silent rescuer, that danger drew ever near. Jacob, for all his competence and determination, feared once more caring for someone he might fail to protect. Their silences were laden with guilt, with longing, with a fierce mutual respect neither dared name just yet. One evening, as the wind howled and the air bit with the promise of snow, Jacob found Sarah standing alone in the doorway, her silhouette outlined against a silvered sky. "Will they find me?" she whispered, voice catching. Jacob stood beside her, not touching, but closer than before. "Let them come," he replied, a vow laced with memories and hope in equal measure. "You're not alone anymore." As dawn crept over the frozen pines, both understood in the unexpected sanctuary they had forged something fragile, and true was taking root. Their souls, battered and mistrustful, had begun that slow, painful process of mending together. But beyond the cabin walls, fresh threats gathered like a storm. Even as trust turned at last toward something deeper, the repercussions of betrayal, money, and violence approached from the cold horizon, ready to test all they had built. Stay with us, because in the next chapter, the ghosts of the past are about to step from the darkness, demanding a price neither Jacob nor Sarah May can foresee. The memory of Marcus Thornfield haunted Sarah May, and Jacob long before his shadow returned to claim them. In the hush of each cold morning as wind pressed ghost-like against the windows, fear became a silent third presence, filling the spaces between their cautious words and tentative hopes. Marcus, that name alone, could chill bone and blood alike. He wasn't just a man, he was a storm learned to dress in velvet cruelty cloaked beneath wealth and law, a monster civil enough to sign contracts with the same hands that rumor whispered once snuffed out 2 wives whose names vanished into the hush of polite society. It began with the weight of secrets. Sarah, sitting on the edge of her borrowed bed, fingering the gold locket worn thin by hope, stared into the flames and tried to silence the aching litany in her mind. You are his property purchased in gold and thin promises. Each night replayed the threats. Marcus spat words drenched in entitlement as he cornered her father, waving deeds and debts like hunting knives. Her mother trembling beside the stove, too frightened or complicit to speak. Marcus promising salvation, but trading only terror. The terror was not just for herself. Sarah's heart clenched with guilt for the family she'd left behind, Emma, her fragile sister still within her father's reach, and her parents trapped in a web spun by their own desperation and the machinery of Marcus's greed. Sarah saw herself in the stories she'd grown up hearing, girls claimed by men whose power dwarfed the law, mothers silenced, and sisters vanishing into the night. She had escaped, but only by running headlong into wilderness and the arms of a stranger. Jacob, meanwhile, watched the horizon for more than just pursuit. He had seen men like Marcus before, men who built reputations on cruelty so systematic that it seemed almost logical, men who used the law as both shield and sword. Marcus was more than a threat to Sarah. He was Jacob's own unfinished business. The law had failed Mary, Jacob's lost love in another life, and now threatened to fail Sarah as well. The knowledge rattled Jacob, awakening old rage and self-hatred long buried beside Mary's grave. These fears came to life one evening when noises outside the cabin thinned a barrier between dread and reality. Jacob's practiced eyes counted 4 shadows moving among the trees. The attackers moved with purpose, too sure of themselves to be mere drunks or lost travelers. Sarah's breath caught as Jacob handed her the spare Colt, the hard lessons of the last days crystallizing into necessity. For the first time, she saw herself not as a victim, but as someone forced into the crucible. Her hands shook because she knew Marcus had finally come. When the voices came calling for Sarah May by name, demanding what was owed to Marcus, anger flared in her chest, hot and cleansing. Every twist of the law Marcus wielded, every rumor he had paid to spread, and every man he'd bought, had been designed to make her feel less than human. Now, as bullets cracked through the night, she found resolve boiling up from grief and humiliation. No more. Jacob's plan, his secret tunnel, the careful traps, held off the first attack, letting them escape into icy woods, with only blood and terror as their companions. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Marcus was a hydra. Cut down one plan and another, more ruthless, would take its place. He could bribe judges, cook legal documents, even smear her name in broadsheets from Helena to Denver. His reach extended through the gilded salons of the territory, and down to muddy backrooms, where fortunes and fates were destroyed with a flourished signature. The couple spent those days running each conversation a battle between hope and fatalism. Jacob described in clipped tones the kind of men Marcus hired: mercenaries, gunslicks, with nothing to lose, and no lines they wouldn't cross. Sarah internalized the darkness coiling around her. She questioned not only her father's broken choices, but her own resolve, the gnawing fear that to save herself, she might forsake her family, or damn Jacob to share her fate. Yet with each new dawn, as the world grew harder, and their means more limited, the pair found themselves transformed. Sarah learned to wield fear as armor. Jacob allowed himself to trust again, letting Sarah's strength drag him out of his guilt's grave. Their growing intimacy was battle-forged. Laughter and touch became their only revolt against the world's grinding machinery. Still, the shadow of Marcus loomed, sharpening the stakes. He was not merely an adversary to be faced down in a dusty street. He embodied the brutality of a world willing to buy and sell lives for a ledger's balance. For Sarah to survive, for Jacob to atone, they would need more than cleverness or firepower. They would have to turn Marcus's own tools, the law, public opinion, even the fear he sowed against him. Now, as they crested the final ridge before Cedar Creek, Sarah's heart hammered, not just with dread, but with a fierce clarity. Marcus had taught her to fear, Jacob to fight. And somewhere in the crucible, where pain became resolve, Sarah May discovered the monster inside herself, one unafraid to stare back at Marcus Thornfield and say no more. And so their journey pressed onward toward new battles against assassins, corrupt officials, and the darkness Marcus left in his wake. But something fundamental had shifted. Now they would no longer merely survive the monster. Together they would face him head-on. The forest that once loomed as a threat now became Sarah May's crucible of transformation. Each morning brought new aches and bruises as she shadowed Jacob through the wilds, learning the language of survival he'd mastered over decades of war and solitude. The bruises on her hands from splitting wood, the sting of icy creek water as she knelt to fill canteens, and the sharp report of his revolver marking her failures and triumphs at target practice all became the scars and calluses of a newfound resilience. Yet it was not just the tasks themselves that changed her. It was how hard she fought not to break under their weight. Early on, her frustration flared. After hours missing every can laden on a log, Sarah's eyes stung with unreleased tears. "Maybe I was only ever meant for parlors and pretty dresses," she hissed, flinging the pistol at the ground. The words stung Jacob, reminding him of all the limitations others had pressed upon her shoulders. Expectations she'd carried even as she ran for her life. Jacob did not offer hollow comfort. He simply picked up the weapon, placed it in her trembling hands, and said, "Keep trying. The only thing we have to lose now is fear." Again and again, through cold dawns and frost-bitten evenings, he taught her. A gun's worth lies not in the threat it creates, but in the courage of the hand that wields it. She learned to harness her trembling, to turn the chaos of her mind into something sharp and clear in the silence before a shot. The process awakened a new anger, not just at the men who hunted her, or the father who'd bartered away her freedom, but at every moment she'd been told to remain small and silent. Each tiny victory, each jarful of nettles gathered, each rabbit snared, became a manifesto. I will not die as their victim. But change hollowed Jacob too. Alone for so long, he had controlled the rhythms of his pain and guilt, keeping them neatly caged within the cabin's walls. Sarah's presence forced those wounds open. as he guided her through rain-soaked undergrowth and showed her how to track a deer. Flashes of Mary lingered in every glade, her laughter in a springtime meadow, her blood on a winter's snow. He wanted to keep Sarah safe, to lock her behind barricades, but to love her meant trusting her strength and letting her risk the world. Their lessons were not just of bullets and bread. Together, crouched by firelight, they shared stories of faith lost and found, of mothers' lullabies and fathers' betrayals. Jacob told her of the night he left Cedar Falls behind, the burning schoolhouse, and his vow to never again fail someone who depended on him. In Sarah's quiet presence, he found absolution, forgiving himself for the first time, for being alive when others were not. The tension between them simmered, Sarah fighting her fear of dependence, Jacob wrestling his need to shield her from harm. They argued over the smallest things, the right way to set a snare, the wisdom of keeping the lamp burning when every flicker might draw Marcus's men. But beneath every disagreement was something elemental, a growing trust, raw and uncompromising. One night, as the wind howled and the wolves sang their hunger, Sarah May woke from dreams of auction blocks and chains. She found Jacob by the fire, carving another wooden bird. She sat beside him, wordless, watching his hands, those same hands that had killed and healed. "I thought I'd never be good at anything but surviving," she whispered. "But you, Jacob, you give me more than survival. You teach me how to fight for my own freedom." He met her gaze, tired, hopeful, humbled. "It's you teaching me, Sarah, how to live again, how to hope that maybe, despite everything, two broken people can make something strong." That night there were no more lessons, no more defenses. They clung to each other, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals, each scar, each loss, each new skill a thread binding them closer. The world outside howled and threatened, but inside that fragile sanctuary, they found reasons to stay, to fight, to grow together. As dawn crept into the clearing, Sarah May placed her hand over Jacob, steady, certain, transformed. "We are not what they made us. We are what we choose each day," she said. And with that vow, they readied themselves for what lay ahead, armed not just with guns and cunning, but with the fierce, stubborn love that had grown in survival's shadow. But far-off crows circled, and news of their wedding was already winding its way toward Marcus's ears. As the sunlight stretched across the mountains, they knew their greatest challenges were yet to come. The time was fast approaching, when everything learned and every bond forged would be tested on the field of battle and the courtroom alike. The morning over Cedar Creek was steel gray, heavy, with the kind of silence that signals a reckoning. Jacob and Sarah May crouched in the brittle autumn brush, muscles tense, hearts hammering, a marriage forged not in peacetime, but in the crucible of survival. All their frostbitten days and whispered nights had brought them here, to a single bloodied crossroads. Marcus Thornfield's mercenaries waited like wolves in the shadows, and the law itself, so easily bent by gold, hovered nearer than ever, ready to lash out under the guise of justice. For Sarah May, fear no longer tasted like weakness, but like iron-hot bracing awake. Memories of her father's betrayal and Marcus's threats swirled in her mind, mingling with the hard-won lessons of this wild country. She felt her own hands clench around the revolver Jacob had taught her to fire, recalling not just the practice shots by the creek, but his words, "You defend what matters. You draw the line with your own blood if you have to." As the first shots cracked from the hotel, Marcus's hired guns, making their show of force, Sarah May realized none of these men knew her. The trembling girl who had once sobbed at her family's kitchen table was gone. In her place, a woman who would never again be bartered away. Jacob, too, felt the ghosts closing in. He'd prepared traps and war tactics all night, every muscle remembering his years as a captain, every scar a ledger of debts he could never settle. But this fight was more than a contest of skill, it was a test of redemption. Each bullet meant returning to that half of himself he'd tried to seal away, cold, decisive, merciless. And yet, with Sarah by his side, every act of violence was weighed against a singular hope that after all this, they might simply be allowed to live. The town's main street erupted in chaos. Jacob's dynamite sent splinters and smoke into the morning light, raining sharp reminders of how close death pressed in, how desperately those with power clung to their illusions of control. Sarah's shots rang true, not out of vengeance, but furious love. Every muzzle flash, every shouted order, every stumble across broken glass forced the couple to blend instinct, trust, and raw resolve. Inside, the fight was personal. Marcus, cornered and desperate, revealed the full extent of his ruthless ambition, wielding legal papers as wounding as knives, daring anyone to challenge the fiction of his power. The law is for those who can afford it, he railed, brandishing the contract that had bound Sarah's life to his will. It almost worked. The deputies and bystanders, cowed by years of Thornfield money, hesitated. But as the battle outside ebbed and lawmen pressed in, Sarah stepped forward, dirty, disheveled, more formidable than any judge. Her voice did not waver as she read aloud Marcus's letters, evidence of debts, manufactured addictions, fed a family ensnared. The crowd's outrage grew with every word. At last, Sarah May took the fraudulent marriage contract and ripped it in half, letting the pieces fall like the last snows of winter, her declaration slicing through generations of obedience. My freedom is not for sale. The final minutes detonated with the truth, Marcus's last cowardly violence, his concealed pistol, his willingness to kill, rather than lose, met Jacob's rifle, and justice, uncoiling like lightning. In that flash, blood and dust settled on a town forever changed. But the violence spun out new complications. The sheriff arrived, lawful and wary, forced to balance loyalty against real justice. The federal marshal, brandishing an arrest warrant, threatened to drag everything into the black hole of political power. Yet Sarah's public defiance, bolstered by hard evidence, and the voices of the town, swayed the tide. Communities, like individuals, find their limit. And on that day, Cedar Creek chose to stand with the truth. In the hush after the battle, Jacob's hands were bloodied but gentle. Sarah was battered but unbowed. Together they faced the crowd, victims no more, but partners in both struggle and triumph. Yet the war was not entirely over. The legacy of Marcus's money, the web of corrupt officials, the old wounds of law and loyalty, they would not vanish overnight. But Jacob and Sarah May, forged in the fires of violence and loss, had become more than survivors. They were a testament to the power of courage and love in a land that so often rewarded neither. As the sun broke over the horizon and the wounded town exhaled, Sarah felt a fierce clarity settle within her. The battles for love, autonomy, and justice are never truly won. They must be chosen again and again with every dawn. So when at last Jacob took her hand, their wedding rings a simple promise hammered in hardship, they walked forward toward the next struggle, the next possibility, shoulder to shoulder. Because the real victory was not just freedom from Marcus, but the freedom they had claimed for themselves together. The horizon beckoned with promise and peril. But this time Sarah May and Jacob faced it on their own terms, stronger, changed, and unafraid. The echoes of gunfire slowly faded, replaced by the cautious hush of a town waking to its own redemption. Cedar Creek, marked now by broken glass, splintered doorways, and faces peeking from behind curtains, was forever changed. In the golden haze of morning light, Sarah May and Jacob stood among the ruined survivors of violence and lawlessness. Yes, but also witnesses to the resilience of chosen love over inherited cruelty. Yet freedom came at a cost, and redemption was not a simple, clean victory. The relief that flooded Sarah as she watched Marcus Thornfield's grip crumble was shadowed by fear for what would follow. Political allies of the dead man would not easily surrender their privilege. There would be investigations, whispers, men arriving from Helena, or even further demanding their version of justice. Jacob, too, felt the burden of what they had done, aware that every act of violence, no matter how justified, carried the seed of new consequences. As the town gathered, wary at first, to reclaim its peace, Jacob and Sarah found themselves at the center of a circle of hesitant hope. Some thanked them quietly, remembering all too well the pain Marcus had inflicted. Others looked on with suspicion, wondering which way the wind of power would blow next. In that uncertainty, Sarah May found her courage once again tested. Returning to her childhood home to confront her parents was an act as brave as any battle. Her father, hollow-eyed but finally free from Marcus's debts, could not meet her gaze. Her mother clung to her, weeping words of apology tumbling out with each tear. It was not immediate forgiveness Sarah offered, but a slow rebuilding, a measured promise that her own future would be forged on different terms. Only when she embraced her little sister Emma and saw the girl's growing strength did Sarah let herself believe that some wounds could in time begin to close. Legal battles ensued. Sarah and Jacob sat through hearings, the weight of hostile stares and probing questions pressing down on them. They presented the letters and contracts salvaged from Marcus's corpse, laying bare his web of blackmail and fraud. Witnesses emboldened by Marcus's absence came forward, ranch hands, local businessmen, even clerks from the courthouse, each piece of testimony weaving a clearer tapestry of the abuse that had haunted the land for years. With every truth brought to light, the chains Marcus had forged grew weaker. Justice this time bent toward the brave. Charges against Sarah's father were dropped after it became clear he had been manipulated and threatened. The property that had once been the prize for Sarah's body now became the foundation for a new beginning, shared, not seized. In the slow turning of seasons, life remade itself around the ashes of conflict. Sarah May and Jacob rebuilt not just their home, but themselves. The Cowboy became a homestead bigger, warmer, open to neighbors and laughter, even the occasional visitor from town. Jacob's hands, long used to carving wood and carrying the weight of old grief, now planted seeds, drew up plans for a larger table, and even learned with awkward tenderness how to hold a newborn when the gentle promise of new life finally bloomed. Sarah became a voice for women in Cedar Creek, quietly fierce, teaching others not to surrender their future to bargains made in back rooms. She insisted her sister finish school. When asked about her journey, Sarah spoke not only of pain, but of the necessity of choosing hope, of learning to claim one's worth, even when the world deems it negligible. Yet shadows sometimes lingered. On restless nights, Jacob would wake heart racing, haunted by the memory of men he could not save, and the fear that if he faltered, fate might steal away the family he'd fought so hard to earn. Sarah, too, carried scars, doubts, and dreams of the past intertwining. As she watched the sunrise from their porch, the wooden bird he had carved years ago perched nearby. In those moments, they leaned into each other's presence, a reminder that while wounds may never fully disappear, they could become maps, a record of how far they'd come, and of all the new places love might take them. As their little one toddled across the yard, laughter ringing clear, Sarah caught Jacob's eye and smiled, a silent vow renewed each day they had traded the comfort of a safe imprisoned life for the risk and beauty of freedom chosen. Their story, once tangled in betrayal and pain, now bloomed with forgiveness, self-determination, and the fragile, fierce promise that hope, if nurtured, endures. If every dawn brings a choice, then this family, broken, remade, and redeemed, knew at last how to choose each other. Their past, marked by cruelty, could not cast shadow forever. The future wide as the Montana hills waited to be written in love, honesty, and courage. And so, under a sky growing ever brighter, Sarah May and Jacob joined now, not by desperation, but by hope, walked forward, hand in hand, toward a new beginning. If you've ever found strength in the ashes of your worst nights, or believed that forgiveness is the hardest, bravest thing we offer, let us know what hope looks like for you. In the end, every story deserves its dawn.